On the 26th of October, 1958, a Boeing 707 lifted off from New York's Idlewild Airport bound for Paris. It landed 7 hours later. 7 hours, New York to Paris, an ocean cross between breakfast and dinner. A year before that flight, the same journey had taken more than 14 hours on the fastest propeller aircraft available. A decade before that, it had taken days. A century before that, it had taken weeks, and most people who made it never came back. 7 hours changed everything. Not just the schedule, not just the ticket price. Everything. The way business worked, the way families stayed connected across continents, the way wars were supplied and diplomats traveled and tourists discovered the world, the way human beings understood the size of the planet they lived on. One aircraft, 7 hours, and nothing was ever the same again. To understand what the 707 actually did to the world, you have to start with the world it arrived into, because that world moved at a pace that is almost impossible to imagine from where we stand now. In the early 1950s, crossing the Atlantic was still an event, not a routine, not an inconvenience, an event, something you prepared for, something you told people about, something that marked a real and significant boundary between the life you were living and the one you were about to encounter on the other side of an ocean. If you flew on propeller aircraft. Beautiful machines, capable machines, but machines that moved at roughly a third of the speed that was coming. A transatlantic flight on a Lockheed Constellation or a Douglas DC-7 took 14 hours on a good day. With headwinds or refueling stops, it could take considerably longer. The seats were comfortable by the standards of the era, the service was excellent, and the experience was genuinely luxurious, if you could afford it, because the other defining characteristic of air travel in the early 1950s was that it was emphatically, exclusively for the wealthy. A transatlantic ticket cost roughly what a working person earned in several months. The people who flew regularly were executives, diplomats, film stars, and the genuinely rich. Everyone else watched from the observation decks at airports, a specific cultural ritual of the era, families gathering to watch aircraft depart for places they would never go and imagined. The world that most people actually lived in was one where distance was real and permanent. Your cousin in another country was genuinely far away. The business deal that required a face-to-face meeting across an ocean was a major undertaking. The conference, the negotiation, the creative collaboration that demanded physical presence, all of it was constrained by the time and money that crossing the Atlantic required. And then there was Boeing. Boeing in the early 1950s was primarily a military company. Its commercial reputation rested on the Stratocruiser, a capable aircraft that airlines operated with professional competence but never loved. And its real credibility was in bombers. The B-47 Stratojet and the B-52 Stratofortress had established Boeing as a dominant force in American strategic air power, and the swept-wing jet technology those aircraft embodied was exactly what the next generation of commercial transport would need. The decision Boeing made in 1952 was one of the most consequential in the history of private enterprise. They committed to building a jet transport prototype, the aircraft that would become the 707, largely at their own expense, before the airlines had committed to buying it, before the technology had been proven in commercial service, before anyone had demonstrated that passengers would pay for tickets on jet aircraft, or that jet aircraft could survive the economics of airline operation. Boeing bet the company, literally. The development cost was equivalent to the company's entire net worth at the time. The executives who signed off on that decision understood that if the commercial market didn't materialize, Boeing might not survive the consequences. It was the right bet, but it was still a bet. What drove it was a clear-eyed understanding of what jet propulsion would do to the economics of commercial aviation, and therefore to the commercial aviation market itself. Jet engines were faster, which meant more flights per aircraft per day. They flew higher above most weather, which meant more reliable schedules. They had fewer moving parts than piston engines, which promised lower maintenance costs over time. And they would eventually burn fuel more efficiently than the complex radial engines of the propeller era, which meant lower operating costs per passenger mile. Put those things together and you got an aircraft that airlines could operate profitably on routes and at price points that had been commercially impossible before. You got an aircraft that could make air travel accessible to people who had never been able to afford it. You got an aircraft that could compress the world. Boeing understood this. They built for it. And in 1958, when the 707 entered commercial service, the world the aircraft created began to emerge. faster, more connected, and more surprising than even the people who built it had fully anticipated. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. The Boeing 707 was different from everything that came before it in ways that were immediately visible and in ways that took years to fully understand. Start with the speed. Cruising at over 500 miles per hour, more than twice the speed of the propeller transports it replaced, the 707 didn't just cut journey times in half, it changed the psychological relationship between distance and time in ways that no specification sheet can fully capture. When a journey that took 14 hours suddenly takes 7, the place you're going doesn't just feel closer, it feels different, it feels accessible. It feels, for the first time, like somewhere you might actually go. The swept wings were the aerodynamic key to that speed, angled backward at a dramatic angle that allowed the aircraft to approach the sound barrier without the compressibility problems that had plagued earlier high-speed designs. They gave the 707 its unmistakable silhouette, the profile that anyone who saw it immediately recognized as something new, something that belonged to a different era than what had come before. The 4 Pratt & Whitney turbojets were mounted in pods beneath and ahead of the wings, a placement that was engineering logic, but that also created the 707's distinctive visual personality. Those 4 pods, those 4 trails of exhaust and sound, became the signature of the jet age in the public imagination. The sound they made, that sustained rising roar that sat at the edge of physical sensation, became the sound of the future arriving. The fuselage was pressurized to a standard that allowed the aircraft to cruise at altitudes where the air was smooth and the weather was below, which meant that passengers who had spent careers enduring the turbulence and noise of lower altitude propeller flights suddenly found themselves crossing oceans in conditions that felt almost civilized. The oval windows, a direct engineering response to the comet disasters that had established, tragically, what happened when window corners concentrated stress at altitude, framed views of sky and cloud that passengers found genuinely extraordinary. You were above the weather, above the turbulence, in the clear, calm air where the only thing visible was the curve of the horizon and the blue that went on forever. And then there was the cabin itself. The 707 was wide enough, significantly wider than the propeller transports most passengers knew, that the interior felt genuinely spacious by the standards of the era. The airlines that operated it knew they had something exceptional and invested in the interior fittings and service to match. Pan American 707 service was an event in itself. TWAs, BOACs, the carriers that flew the 707 knew they were operating the finest commercial aircraft in the world, and they presented it accordingly. The human experience of the 707 era has a quality that distinguishes it from any other period in commercial aviation history, a quality of genuine, felt, unrepeatable excitement that the people who lived through it never fully lost. For the passengers who flew the 707 in its early years, the businessmen and diplomats and celebrities who could afford the tickets, and increasingly the ordinary families who found as the decade turned that jet travel was becoming something they could actually access, the experience was unlike anything they had previously encountered. The acceleration on takeoff was the first revelation, not the gradual, patient building of speed that propeller aircraft produced over a long runway roll, but something faster and more urgent, a push that pressed you back into your seat with a force that felt like the world had decided to get out of the way. Then the climb, the ground falling away faster than your body thought it should. And then altitude, the smooth, quiet air above the weather, the oval window framing a view of clouds below and sky above that no propeller aircraft had routinely offered its passengers. Women who flew the 707 in its early years describe the experience with a consistency that suggests they are describing something real, the sense that the world had just become larger and smaller simultaneously. Larger because you were suddenly aware of how much of it existed and was reachable. Smaller because the ocean you were crossing, which had defined the boundary between home and away for your entire life, was now something you could cross before dinner. The flight attendants who served the 707's early routes have their own chapter of this story. These were women trained to perform absolute composure in an environment that was, in the first months of jet service, genuinely new to them. The aircraft was different, the speeds were different, the altitude was different. The passengers were different in their anxieties and their excitements, some of them gripping armrests through takeoff, some of them pressing their faces to the oval windows with the uncomplicated delight of people seeing something they'd never seen before. The flight attendants moved through all of it with the professional calm that their training demanded, and many of them described those early years as the most vivid of their careers, because everything was new, and newness has a quality that familiarity eventually removes. The pilots who flew the 707 in its first years of service were almost universally men who had built their careers on propeller aircraft, veterans of military flying, of oceanic crossings on Constellations and DC-7s, men whose hands knew how to fly by feel and sound, and the physical feedback of aircraft that talked to them through the controls. The 707 was different in all of those ways, and the transition demanded something specific from them: the willingness to learn differently, to trust instruments over instinct where the two diverged, to master an aircraft whose capabilities exceeded anything their experience had prepared them for. Most of them came to love it. Not immediately, it demanded too much for immediate love, but with time, with hours, with the accumulation of experience that eventually turns a demanding aircraft into a known one, they came to appreciate what the 707 offered in exchange for what it required. It was fast, it was powerful, it was, at altitude in smooth air, capable of a kind of sustained, purposeful flight that nothing propeller-driven had ever quite achieved. One retired Pan American captain, speaking decades after his 707 career ended, described crossing the North Atlantic at night in the 707 as the closest thing to perfect flight he ever experienced. The engine steady, the stars visible through the cockpit windows, the aircraft going exactly where he pointed it, at exactly the speed he commanded, through air that offered no resistance worth naming. The 707's path to dominance was not smooth, and the conflicts it navigated shaped its legacy in ways that the triumphant version of the story sometimes obscures. The shadow of the de Havilland Comet hung over the 707's introduction in ways that were fair and unfair. Fair because the Comet disasters, two aircraft breaking apart at altitude due to metal fatigue around their square windows, had established in the most terrible way possible that jet commercial aviation contained failure modes that the propeller era hadn't encountered. Unfair because Boeing had studied the Comet investigations with the seriousness of engineers who understood the stakes and had built specific, tested responses to what those investigations revealed. The oval windows were one such response. The structural margins were another. The 707 was not the Comet, but in the public mind, the connection between jets and the Comet's tragedy required active, continuous management. Douglas entered the market with a DC-8, a comparable aircraft that arrived roughly a year after the 707 and offered airlines an alternative that was genuinely competitive on most technical measures. The competition between Boeing and Douglas for airline orders drove both companies to continuous improvement of their aircraft and kept the market from settling into the complacency that monopoly sometimes produces. Pan American, with characteristic shrewdness, ordered both, using the competition between manufacturers to drive better terms from each. There were incidents in the early years, not the catastrophic accident that had grounded the Comet, but the ordinary texture of an industry learning a new aircraft. Hard landings, approach instabilities, moments where the gap between trained competence and embodied mastery showed itself in outcomes that were safe but instructive. The FAA tightened training requirements. The airlines revised procedures. The feedback loop between operational experience and training standards ranked continuously through the 707's early years and produced, progressively, a tighter and more complete fit between what the aircraft demanded and what its crews could provide. The economic conflict was perhaps the most sustained. Building jet aircraft required capital investments that strained even large manufacturers. Operating them required airlines to rebuild their entire training and maintenance infrastructure from scratch. The transition period between the propeller era and the jet era was costly for everyone involved, and the carriers that managed it most intelligently, that invested in training and infrastructure and established the operational competencies the jets demanded, were the ones that emerged strongest from the other side. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. The Boeing 707's legacy is not in the aircraft itself, though the aircraft was extraordinary. It is in the world the aircraft made. Every person who has ever boarded a commercial jet and thought nothing remarkable of it is living in the world the 707 created. Every business that operates across continents as a matter of routine. Every family that maintains relationships across oceans because the flights are affordable and the time is manageable. Every cultural exchange, every scientific collaboration, every diplomatic engagement that happened because the people involved could be in the same room by morning. All of it traces back through a chain of development and democratization and accumulated normalcy to the decision Boeing made in 1952 and the aircraft that decision produced. The 707 itself flew for decades, in passenger service, in military adaptation as the E-3 Sentry and the VC-137 that carried presidents, in the tanker roles that extended the reach of American air power around the globe. The design philosophy it established, swept wings, under-wing-mounted jet engines, wide pressurized fuselage, became the template from which virtually every subsequent commercial airliner descended. The 737, the 747, the 757, the 767, the A320, the 787, all of them carry in their fundamental architecture the choices Boeing made when they built the 707. The jet age didn't begin with the 707. The comet had briefly, brilliantly, tragically announced it before the 707 arrived. But the jet age that lasted, the jet age that became the foundation of the modern world, began with the 707, and the world it produced is the one we still inhabit. We began with 7 hours, New York to Paris, breakfast to dinner. The time it takes to watch a few films, read a book, sleep briefly, and wake up somewhere else entirely. 7 hours that changed the world, not by accident, not through any single dramatic moment, but through the accumulated effect of millions of those 7-hour crossings, and the 10-hour crossings, and the 5-hour crossings, and all the other distances the 707 compressed until compression became the expected condition of modern life rather than a marvel worth noticing. The Boeing 707 was a machine. It was aluminum and steel and turbine blades and oval windows and 4 engines that made a sound the world had never heard before and would never stop hearing afterward. It was built by engineers who understood what they were building, and by a company that bet everything it had on being right. They were right, and the world they made with that machine, the connected, compressed, surprisingly small world that 7 billion people now navigate as though its accessibility was always obvious, is their monument, more durable than any museum exhibit, more present than any preserved airframe. Every time a jet lifts off anywhere in the world, it is lifting off from a runway the 707 built. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming.